Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to this discussion on repair and prepare, theological education and living justice. My name is Laura Mariko Heifetz. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm the Assistant Dean of Admissions, Vocation, and Stewardship at Vanderbilt Divinity School. This evening's panel format will be the following. I will introduce the panel and then introduce our panelists and ask them to share a little bit about themselves. We will then have a discussion based on some initial questions about our topic. Throughout the conversation, please feel free to use the chat function in YouTube Live or the comments on Facebook Live to share reactions or to ask questions of the panelists. Be great to hear from you. Before we welcome our panelists, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The Office of Admissions, Vocation, and Stewardship joins the Vanderbilt student government in collectively acknowledging that Vanderbilt University occupies the ancestral hunting and traditional lands of the Cherokee, Shawnee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek peoples. Today, these people have nation boundaries in Oklahoma, North Carolina, and Mississippi, after the Indian Removal Act of 1830 led to the forced removal of Southern tribes to the west of the Mississippi River. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the Treaty of Hopewell. We recognize and support the Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now and for those forcibly removed from their homelands. We also recognize the resistance, strength, and pride of other people of color whose ancestors worked, lived, and bled on this land without benefit or without due compensation. We stand as accomplices alongside you in the fight for equity. So this panel came about since Vanderbilt Divinity School has a legacy of racial and gender justice work, stretching back at least to the nascent civil rights movement, but there have been a lot of mistakes made along the way. One of those mistakes, as was in the description for this panel, was Vanderbilt University expelling civil rights nonviolent leader and divinity student James Lawson, with both students and faculty protesting. And even through that, many years later, the institution of Vanderbilt University and Vanderbilt Divinity School are now home to the James Lawson Institute for the Research and Study of Nonviolent Movements, and also to the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative, and are guided by these living documents, the purposes and commitments. So how do we get from here to there? Or maybe how do we continue to go between making mistakes and to working to repair the damage done? So I would like to bring in our panelists. Thanks to those of you who are introducing yourselves in the chat. So here is our first panelist. Welcome, Damien. Damien Pascal Domenack is a Peruvian immigrant raised in Southern California. He's a Santero priest and a candidate for ordination in the Unitarian Universalist tradition, whose ministry centers queer, transgender, Black, and brown immigrant communities of which he is a part. He is a VDS alum, a double door, MDiv and THM, and is now studying his PhD at Drew University. So welcome back, Damien. Always great to share space with you. Next, we have Dr. Phyllis Isabella Sheppard, the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Associate Professor of Religion, Psychology, and Culture, and Director of the James Lawson Institute at Vanderbilt University. As a practical theologian, Dr. Sheppard is recognized for her contributions to practical theology, psychology, and religion, womanist methodology, cultural studies, pastoral theology, and spiritual practices. Her current book, coming out from Roman and Littlefield, Lexington, is Tilling Sacred Ground, Interiority, Black Women, and Religious Experience. I'd also like to bring in Dr. Teresa Smallwood, Esquire, who is the Associate Director of the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative at Vanderbilt Divinity School, and will soon be the James Franklin Kelly and Hope Eister Kelly Associate Professor of Public Theology at United Lutheran Seminary. So we wish her very well and are so excited that we at least have this conversation with her. So thank you all. And Dr. Sheppard, I'm wondering if there's anything else you'd like to say to introduce yourself. And also, I wanted to ask you to share a little bit more about the James Lawson Institute and what it does.
Thank you. No, you said plenty. I hope I can live into that description you gave. A little bit more about the James Lawson Institute. The Lawson Institute is a collaborative, if you will. It's an initiative that is situated between the Divinity School and the College of Arts and Sciences. The story is that Reverend Lawson, Dean Towns, I believe Dr. Smallwood was in that conversation as well, and others sat down and had a conversation and said something. And this may be my fantasy of what was said. I wasn't in the room. The time is now. I'll just say that the time is now. And the now of it is that it was time to both institutionalize what we'll talk about more, but what has happened between Lawson being expelled and this, what I would call this rapprochement, this repairing process. It's all process. And so what the Lawson is designed to do is to, one, advance, spread, and train people for the methods in nonviolent movement that Lawson began honing back in the 50s and still is engaged in across multiple issues around justice and justice-making movements. That's one. The other is to bring the research that has been done and the research that needs to be done into a hub. In other words, making people aware of the fact that nonviolent movements, nonviolent strategies are effective. And there's research that demonstrates this. Being in a university, of course, we like data. There's research that tells us this. And the third piece of it is preparing the next generation. I like to say that, one, we don't wake up saying, I'll be nonviolent. And two, just because we don't engage in violence, that's not the same thing as having a nonviolent strategy, which involves, I like to think it involves a transformation of our hearts and minds and our practices based on the teachings, but it also is a form of resistance to what Lawson calls the United States love affair with violence. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for bringing that in. I wanted to turn to Dr. Smallwood and ask, is there anything else you want to say to introduce yourself? And if you could also share a little bit about the Public Theology Racial Justice Collaborative and what it is up to.
Thank you so much, Laura, and I really appreciate being on this panel. I don't have anything more to share in terms of an introduction, but I most definitely would like to expound upon what I believe is the unfolding of a true visionary's work. In the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative, what you have is the dean of the Vanderbilt Divinity School being asked, do you have a vision about public theology and racial justice? And her response being, yes, we think we can reach that. Mm-hmm. And here I am, here as an associate director, kind of being the day-to-day operative to make it come alive. This is a dream because we are all still dreaming in the vein of Martin King. We're all still hoping for that day when everyone, whoever it is, and wherever you come from, can feel some kind of acceptance and belonging. And unfortunately, America in its present ethos is still battling, still struggling, still in tension about who belongs and who should be othered. And this particular work focused for the last 4.5 years since I've been here upon how we could create not some new organization, but how we could create an atmosphere, a symmetry place, really a hub, if you will, for people to give thought, serious critical thought to what it means to live your faith out loud and to have something to say about the injustices that marginalize and oppress people, people who are in those communities of faith, but are not a part of what we call the dominant culture. And we have had fun. The Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative does just that. We seek to collaborate. We've collaborated with Damien, who through his own work went to do some serious work alongside his other kinds of things that he does spiritually. We work with our students to acclimate them to the community's needs so that we're not just dealing with theory, but we are marrying theory with praxis. And this praxeological aspect of the theological institution means that we have taken seriously the work that Dr. Lawson was doing. And we've now come to a place where through the work that we've done as PTRJC and now the work that Dr. Sheppard will do and has been doing for the last 4 or so months, we've worked to a point where not only are we institutionalizing the thought that this is work that should be in the academy, but now we are bringing voice to the fact that it will stay in the academy. My work has been funded completely by an outside entity. That was the Henry Luce Foundation. And as you know, foundation money comes and it goes. But when an institution like Vanderbilt decides it wants to invest in that work, then I think we can say we're on our way to reparation, to repairing the breaches that we created. That's my work.
Thank you so much. Not only an introduction to your work, but also just a reminder of how inspiring the work can be, even when it's hard. Thank you. Damien, anything else we need to know about you? And then I'm wondering, one of the things that I don't think I said this yet, but you worked on redrafting the purposes and commitments to be more like fresh, contemporary living document. Just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that process and how the purposes and commitments shape learning experiences.
Definitely. Thank you for bringing up the purposes and commitments. So the purposes became active objectives through this work of reimagining what this document is for. If it's not living, what is it? What is its purpose? And so using active language means using verbs and not having a 5 to 7 page document that lives inside of a database. It actually needs to feed the community into practice. And so I saw it as an invitation to radical vulnerability, something that Rishad Nagar and Rusbeth Shirazi, they defined it as a vulnerability that seeks to reimagine the temporalities and meanings of knowledge-making partnerships by surrendering to a politics of collaboration, co-authorship, coordinating. And so embedded in this relational radical vulnerability, we were striving to internalize what we knew was real, which was we are entangled in each other's everyday actions. And how does our values as the body of VDS, how do we move into those commitments that we are making every day? Through sharing a classroom together, through reading a syllabus. And so when we have challenges that create a sort of feeling that causes challenge, really going through the commitments and reading them is one way of going about it, but then actually turning them into tools was what we were reimagining. And working with staff, faculty, even the board of visitors were invited to these conversations that were not just conversations, they were full-on workshops. And so having these workshops around each and every one of the commitments in order to actually live into the verbs, live into the action, that was the drafting in itself. It was about the action. And that spoke to the ethos of VDS and what the community was calling us to.
Thank you for sharing a little bit about that. I had an additional question. I think it was for Dr. Sheppard, but the rest of you, of course, could weigh in on it. That sometimes it's like, it's kind of easy to look at the story arc, right? Of having this massive conflict, really, when Jim Lawson was expelled from the university, and to have students protesting, have faculty resigning in protest, and then to end up here where he is in a positive relationship with the university, and we are trying our best to live into his legacy. But I think, like, I don't want to gloss over, I guess, the difficulty of that kind of work in community, and just wondering if you might be willing to speak a little to that.
Yes, yes, yes. I think one thing we should keep in mind, even as we look at the systemic, but also to hold the individual, I think one of the things that makes this repairing possible at Vanderbilt is in who the man Reverend James Lawson is. He describes himself as a Jesus follower, and that this kind of the work of justice making, of course, is a part of that, but also this capacity to be in this relationship with Vanderbilt, I think reflects that as well. So in order to do that, I think it absolutely requires that we not gloss over that the horrendous injustice that was done to him by expelling him, but also holding the fact that there were faculty and students who resisted that decision, who walked alongside him, joined with him. So holding both of those, not that one side outweighs the other, but that we recognize that the arc has many arcs within it. And then the other, I think, of course, has to be institutional, and that is that there be figures, schools and individuals who constantly call us as an institution into this deeper transformation, because that's how I see this, as part of the transformation of Vanderbilt University. Dr. Smallwood alluded to that in her comments, that it's not just that we come up with a program, an institute, or public theology and racial justice, but both of these come out of this repairing process, come out of this justice leading process. And we also know that there are impulses that resist such movements, and that's why commitment is required on our part. That's why the purposes and commitments speak to me, because they call me into the continued work of myself, and call me to call the institution into it. So I think that the Lawson Institute represents that part that we might call that deep desire to be what it is we claim we believe. And I see it as ongoing hard work that requires preparation, requires commitment, requires repair, and also requires owning. I believe in a sort of confessional, the naming and the witnessing that goes with that. Yeah.
Did any of you have any follow-up, or if not, I have another question.
A follow-up to the commitments?
Oh, to Dr. Sheppard's statements just about that, like, relationality.
Yeah, absolutely. It made me think, Dr. Sheppard, when you talk about confessional naming, about the transparency of that act, and about how trust building begins in that way, through being transparent, through the vulnerability of saying, we are committing to being accountable to these actions that actually cause challenge and discomfort, but ultimately that is the commitment that we are creating together to move forward in trust and faith. And so I see that as, when I say the ethos of Vanderbilt or VDS, what I'm saying is the ethos to lead in these modes of trust. And so I think that clarified it for me as well, is you're leading individually, but you're also alongside folks who are not just training in theological education.
Right.
You're actually embodying what it means to be accountable to commitment.
Mm-hmm. Along that same line, and this goes back to Dr. Smallwood describing the beginning of the public theology and racial justice, that there are also external powers that call us into who, hold up a mirror and say, either we invite you to do this, or are you at this point? And that's what Dr. Smallwood was saying about what the Luce Foundation did. They stepped into the road that we were on, let's say, came with us. And I think the other piece, Damien, that you're pointing to is the curricular piece, that alongside, public theology, racial justice, the Lawson Institute is a curricular transformation that, well, in our case, that Dean Towns initiated by when she came in, I think it was maybe her second year, where she held a mirror up to the faculty and the staff and said, our curriculum has not altered significantly in about 20 years. Mm-hmm. And so the curriculum also is a part of this repairing and preparing process. But that requires transformation of the curriculum and not dipping in, but this sort of turning it upside down. What does our commitment to justice, racial justice that's represented in the purposes and commitments, what does it need to look like in the curriculum today? And what does it need to point toward? Because we're always looking forward as we take note of what's behind us. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking too about the work of the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative. One reason why it grabbed me so much was because there is like the curricular aspect or the co-curricular aspect where students can really engage in some of that work and do some of the research that is part of the reason why they came to Vanderbilt and have an opportunity to do that. But that the collaborative also does a ton of work out in the Nashville community that I think not everyone is always aware of. I know there are a couple of times, I believe, the work showed up in the newspaper just because of the work, the great organizing work that Dr. Smallwood has done in connecting with members of the community out there. And wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how it has to go somewhere, right? It's the public facing as well as the internal integrity.
I would, and I would like to preface my thoughts around Dr. Lawson himself, because if I've done anything, I've tried to model a lot of what he is and what he stands for. When Z. Alexander Luby's home was bombed, it was students around the Fisk and perhaps even Vanderbilt University, but most definitely Fisk students who rose to the occasion. They were folk in the community who saw that and joined. And when that silent march happened down to the mayor's door, there were people from all over Nashville a part of that march. And James Lawson was right in the midst of that kind of action, nonviolent action. And what people know and what I know about neighborhoods is that they remember, they have a memory. And it is the memory that keeps alive the legacy. Lawson's legacy predates a good bit of this repair work we're doing. But it was Lawson's embodiment of an understanding about his own sociality, but also his own faith commitments that brought about the kinds of changes that we've seen in Nashville that have been longstanding. And I cannot discount the fact that there were people employed by Vanderbilt working in the Divinity School who thought it not robbery to give up their livelihood to stand in solidarity with that. For me, coming into this work and knowing that history, it was not hard for me to take that mantle, take that baton, go out to the community and tell a different story. Perhaps Vanderbilt expelled folk in the past, but now I want to stand beside you. I want to work with you. Let me put my hands to the plow just like you do, because I recognize the importance of taking all of my skills, all of my track record, all of my organizing capacity, all of my preparation, all of my skill set to help with the issues that are, for us, everyday issues. Racism is quotidian in its nature. It's everywhere all day long. But the fight comes when people of faith, particularly, can say something very simple to themselves on the inside about what it means to live with folk on the outside. And so we have done things like raise up a community garden. We've had students work with kids in the freedom schools, helping them to author their own books. We've had students have worked together with kids who then had their artwork put on the side of buses. We've had students do deep research around why certain really terribly oppressed groups don't get into the stream of what's going on racially. Had our students who have been nicely resourced, because our grant gave them the capacity to have funds to do this work and do it well. And what that means is that now they walk out of here with degrees, yes, but with a modicum of commitment to the issues that we must have. So when the question is asked of our graduates, what does the Lord require of you? We got some answers.
I can name the ways that I was helped by the grant itself. So my research was in Peru, and I specifically was looking at the ways that the Afro-Peruvian community is affirmed through dance within Catholic festivals. And I couldn't let that research just sit in my thesis. And I needed it to get out to, and I found an avenue, I found a mode, which was the Center for Latin American Studies has a program for K through 12 schools that does, they are in need of curriculum that is new for Latinx Heritage Month. And I was able to send over a few of my my research materials so that they can use to show that there is Black Latinx communities in Latin America, and to show the ways that culture is expressed and how they can link together both dance, religion, and music, place of affirmation, and to see that Black folk are Latinx.
I was also thinking a little bit too, in terms of wanting to, I think especially in Divinity School, I think this can happen, wanting to have like the right thinking and the right acting. And sometimes I think that's like it's a white supremacist value, right? That perfectionism. But we're also not always super well socialized into being able to live into the friction of the theory and theology and practice, that we don't always have a chance to really practice that. And I feel like both with the James Lawson Institute, what we're looking at, and then also with the Public Theology Racial Justice Collaborative, what we're looking at is that turning theory and theology into practice and making space for people to not always do it perfectly. I'm just wondering if you all have any reflections on that or have seen that lived out many times.
Well, in one way you're talking about, or one way I think about it is the pedagogical moment. A lot of us were raised up, if you will, that you don't tell your mistakes in your teaching, or you don't tell your mistakes about your teaching. And I think one of the ways we help diminish some of that anxiety and resist that there is such a thing as being perfect at doing this work. There is not a perfect, it doesn't exist. That is a fantasy that there's a perfect way. There are effective ways, but that doesn't equal perfect. So I think one of the things that that I try to do is name what's worked and what hasn't worked, because not everything works. And so my call isn't to perfection. My call is to commitment, staying on the line, and also being open to, being available to those who are on the line with me, who have other ideas, who value theory, like what is the theory and philosophy of what we're doing, and who value that has to be combined with feet on the sidewalk, feet working or tilling the ground, as Dr. Smallwood mentioned, the community garden, etc. There's a way in which I think theological education, and it's moving in this direction, and I see it beautifully and wonderfully here at the Divinity School, that we put ourselves on the line. We're all on the line with this. We may be at, lines are long, so we may be at different points on the line and be in different points on the relationship to the injustice we're struggling against, but we put our bodies and our minds on the line. Heads, heart, hands, feet. When we do that, there's no way we can collapse into the theoretical without a consideration of praxis. The praxis, by that I mean not just what we do, but that we actually do deep critical reflection on what we're doing, what we've done, and what we hope to do, so that we bring theology and what, the work together.
Coming from a student's perspective, I think and as a second career student at that, walking into the classrooms with folks who expected to come from a very theoretical space and stay there, I participated in a lot of group discussions where we created modes for people to be able to express that need, but also to make aware that that's not ever going to be here because of the commitment to praxis and the commitment to working through your context and what created this theoretical world that is comfortable when you're sitting alongside folks who are struggling. And so having these really difficult conversations and discussion groups, it had the chaos of spirit. We'll just say that. Spirit was present. And at the same time, we had to really work our tools. And the tools are present because you have to work, you actually have to practice them. And so there were various different roles that we could fall into. And especially with praxis and theory in the same room. And really showing the ways that they integrate. That's the work of the classroom. And that's how I was basically leaning into not facilitating or playing a role in that sense, but actually making sure that the environment was present for us to have the opportunity to invite each other there. By taking care of each other. Like, I know that you need that context. I know that you need that theory to hold on to. How about we do that? And I think that those conversations were facilitated really well by a trusted group of folk in discussion groups that were like during first year, in the formative year of theological education. First year, your Bible's broken down. A lot of different things are broken down where you're like trying to figure out where you fall into and what your beliefs are at this point because of biblical interpretation and whatnot. And so it all comes to the table at discussion groups. And so that was a big place. And I learned that very fast. So I would say, yeah, when it comes to the challenges and when it comes to what it means to the community, the role is there's various roles for you to take. And I think that the role in itself is made for action.
I can really ditto that if it's okay.
Mhm.
I recall seeing students who were already part of the collaborative fellowship just come alive and figure things out when the tornado hit here in Nashville. It was devastating. I mean, I can still see the shambles of houses over in North Nashville. And one student in particular, I think, really connected in such a deep and spiritual way that now the project that she's working on is about ecology. She was there when, when we're planting the garden. She's from Africa, I think I can say that much. And so her collaborative project is about the very thing that she saw going on. And how do we repair communities when everybody's house is broke down? But this was a blessing for us. No, we didn't get it completely right. We didn't have that kind of money, but we were able to give out, $150,000 to various and sundry folk that we had collaboration with. And then on top of that, we put our minds together and figured out how to get some of that CARES Act money. And before it was all over, we were able to distribute about $1 million to hurting, broken families. They understood. The students understood what it meant to make that thing that they have in their head work for the folk walking down the street.
You remind me, Teresa, when we went over to North Nashville right after the tornado, and how quickly one of the first things we noticed, I mean, it's the day after the tornado, and there are folks who are coming from far and wide trying to figure out how they can exploit it, the neighborhood. And I mean, what was so beautiful about the work that students and others did through these collaboratives is that they quickly read those signs of, we'll give you a piece of change and buy your house because it's, there's no way you can fix this up. That's the kind of work that I think helps integrate theory and practice. When you see this, and then you see how it, as I like to say, you help students follow the money. Help students see how the money works and works against particularly poor and marginalized people and communities. And then you have this program that comes in and pushes right up against that. That's not only beautiful, that is repairing, that is preparing, that is justice work. And if theological education isn't doing that, then, well, you all know what I think. If we're not doing that, we got to close the doors.
Being one of the students on the ground, what was really amazing for me was seeing alums and current students working alongside and seeing the signs, and also making the dates happen, making the times happen, making sure that Know Your Rights workshops were occurring, that that land was not taken, but was actually spoken for by the people that owned it. And like the garden happened. Like that was like, that was it. It was like, it's happening. Beyond that, I think also just the ways that mutual aid collectives were just sparking up throughout the city and then connecting with each other to share skills and also just to share resources for folks without electricity who couldn't get on to say what their needs were. There were chains of networks that were created through that actually helped through the pandemic and stayed strong. And so that form of sustainability and commitment to community are words in the academy, but not when you make them a purpose and an actual commitment to the practice that you're both accountable to inside the academy and outside, because that's who you run into. You run into alums, you run into current students, and it's about the act of acting alongside and with. As well as faculty members, right? And staff.
We do have a question from a community member. I'll put it up on the screen. Is there any chance for communities and institutions who refuse to acknowledge the harm they have done? How does an individual promote change within such institutions? Any words of wisdom?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'll just begin by saying I think this is a great question. It is a great question. You know, the fact is that all institutions resist the change that is required, as do all individuals. And even sometimes even when they're trying to transform. So when the question is there any chance? Well, if someone had asked and, back when Lawson was being expelled, was there a chance? I think a lot of people would have said no. So one way to think about it is that the chance that is being referred to may be future tense, but that is why the ongoing effort to bring about change is so important. In other words, the resistance to change is important. And of course, one of the most crucial things about that is naming the resistance, naming how the resistance is institutionalized. So, we think about, I'm sure many of us have heard about, the iceberg, cultural iceberg, and there are certain values, ways of being that are very explicit. We say things like, we do this around here, and everybody nods their head, yes, that's what we do. Then there's another level that's a little more subtle. And then some people say, well, sometimes this is what happens, and that raises it to the top. But then at the, where the iceberg is really below the ground is the ways in which institutions have their individual institutional ways of pushing against change that are subtle, can barely be seen. But the people who experience that, they can name it. But the institution, whatever we mean by that, either the powers that be or the policies, et cetera, can't name that, because those who are experiencing it are the ones who are pulling that Band-Aid off. That's a long haul work. And so I think as long as we're in that institution, we are called, we are required, we are obligated to expose it, at all the opportunities that we have. Of course, I also think even as we're doing work in institutions, that's not the only place we're doing work. That can't be, because if it were, we wouldn't see how it gets lived out, because we'd be so busy focused on the policies, et cetera, that are going on institutionally. But also the work in the community, the work that we do on the ground gives us data, and it gives us strategies for what we do institutionally. In other words, I don't have a lack of hope for institutions. I put my feet in institutions, and I put my feet on the street in community.
Absolutely. I mean, so being a second career student as an organizer, for a long time, what I was struggling with was the fact that articles and books would come out like 5 years after we did the thing. And so to really understand that change is happening, and that's why to live into a document means practice. And as Dr. Sheppard was talking, I was reminded of the many deep listening circles that were workshopped throughout the school, so that we could actually understand what culture we were a part of and what culture we wanted to move into through practice. And so this is, when it comes to institutional change, there's institutional memory, and there's also just managing what is comfortable. And what is comfortable is what we're used to. And when we're talking about small instances of discomfort within an institution, and then you bring the fact that you want to create a giant form of discomfort by changing a thing, working alongside folks who have done it and actually coming together with folks who understand the type of institution that you're in, those two things really work together, because you can see the vision in their eyes, and it's not just a vision because they live into it as well. And so it takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy because there aren't many faculty members who are like, let's workshop deep listening circles, right? Like willingly. That ultimately takes a lot more energy, not just for the professors, but also for the students to show up and do it. And so, yeah, when I think of institutions right now that are not allowing, like theological schools that are not allowing LGBTQI folks in, and what that means, right? For folks who come out while they're in theological education and aren't given the dignity of even existing within that institution anymore. And so the organizing work that they're doing is coming together with queer seminarians who have done the work of reading the Bible in a queer way, of doing hermeneutics in a queer way, of sharing the resources that they're in need of, not just to claim their faith, that's the first step, but also to claim their dignity and be willing to fight the fight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's another question here from one of our colleagues. I've had some sacred conversations with students who get burned out from being a student activist. Any particular pedagogies or practices that help with awareness?
Mm-hmm.
So I know that Dr. Sheppard has the real answer, but I'm going to talk from my own experience and say self-care is the best care. And what I mean by that is you are no good to the cause when you let yourself burn from both ends. And so you have to determine, what are the things, what are the rituals? How am I grounded? And how can I get to that place of groundedness to refresh?
Mm-hmm.
I have often said to students, I know that exam times can be very difficult, but you have to take some time to just experience yourself in a spiritual fashion. My go-to ritual is to light up some sage, sit by and soak up the smoke. And sometimes I'll get a little corner of Courvoisier and a Coke chaser. The point being, you have to find the thing that helps you ground yourself, because being worn out won't help anybody. This is why my ancestors sang the song. They sang, you cannot give up. And they sang it in this fashion. They said, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. But they didn't understand that the refrain was, I don't feel no ways tired. The reason is I went and got some rest.
Mm. 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 Well, Dr. Smallwood had the answer. What I would add to that is that that we don't engage in our practices, spiritual and otherwise, when we're burned out. That's not when we start. These practices have to be daily, from the beginning. I tell students and anybody who will listen that if I don't begin my day with a period of meditation and devotion, I don't know what will happen when I walk out the front door.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is that the things that I believe in about how I need to treat people, how I need to stay engaged with myself and with what's important out in front of me, can become very blurred because I'm not in tune. For me, it's being in tune with the spirit. If I'm not in tune, and that involves, of course, ritual, I believe it involves listening to the wisdom of the ancestors. And we don't know what that wisdom is unless we create the space on the regular of inviting them to share that wisdom
Amen.
with us. We have to do that. And that's, that's not like once a month, that is daily. Begin our day, middle of the day, end our day. Because sometimes when it comes down to it, when push comes to shove, that's all we have. And that may be when we're doing something in the community, that may be when we're involved in an action, and that may be when we're sitting in a classroom and we hear something totally, totally enraging. Anything we do outside of that focus on what we're being called to is happenstance.
Mm-hmm.
It's not strategy. It's not an embodiment of the call. So commitment, I think we have to have as much commitment to the work we're called to as we do to self and community care. Of course, this is why there are so many, I think, students in the chaplaincy concentration who are interested in doing chaplaincy with activists in community, because they're recognizing that communities can be exhausted and depleted.
That's right.
And imagine a whole community of inviting the ancestors to speak their wisdom to us on a regular basis.
Yes, all of that, every single word and every single action of all that Dr. Sheppard and Dr. Smallwood just spoke into. And for me, it's been acknowledging the fact that my body is actively speaking and really taking in what I'm saying by being present when I'm not ready to. And knowing that messages are happening without me knowing, just by being there. And so really understanding what it means to have a physical and spiritual boundary that is actually a form of love when it comes to taking care of yourself. And I'm talking about boundaries, not barriers, because those are created as well. And I learned that through movement chaplaincy. I learned that there were certain actions that I was called to being a part of, and certain ones that I was just not ready physically, emotionally, and spiritually to be present for. And that was it was a tricky learning experience, but it was necessary. And I moved into that formation fully when I did CPE chaplaincy, because I was able to be more self-aware and self-reflective and actually be into that mode without the pandemic being like present and not knowing, and without all of the different actions that were at play. And so when you have a tornado, a pandemic, and racial injustice, you might not want to be at every action, right? And so there was a mode of like, okay, how do I take care of folks who are at the front lines, but also when do I step back and allow for the care for myself? And so I learned that through it's community faith. No, it's
Faith Matters at Work.
Faith Matters at Work. Yes, Faith Matters at Work. I learned that through the Faith Matters Network. Just knowing the ways that they set up these 1-hour conversations where we were just able to speak into all of the hardships, all of the things that were going on within our own scope, and allow our body to speak the hardships. Like that's really what it comes down to for me, is through, because I'm a santero, my practice is embodied. And so my dance is every day. And that's a language. And so when my language is happening without me knowing, that's a problem. I got to go back in. I got to go see what I'm saying, right? And so, yes, it's a practice of speaking to the ancestors, of meditation, of coming back into yourself
Mhm.
And for me, that definitely takes place in creating this boundary. So I can do that.
It makes me think, and go ahead. Dr.
Oh, I was just going to say, Damien, we should acknowledge that Jennifer Bailey, who is in charge of Faith Matters Network, is a graduate.
That's
Yes.
right.
Yes, yes.
Yes. I was just going to say, in response to Damien's point about the importance of embodiment, one of the things we do in the spirituality and social activism course, there's the concentration and the course, I have students, touch their abdomen, and I ask them, what is your gut saying to you? Because one of the first things that happens when we are exhausted and we become depleted is that we lose that capacity for that deep listening. That we lose our contact with our body, which is speaking to us all the time. So yes, reintegrating or reestablishing our relationship with the spirit, with our body, and with others, that all goes hand in hand. And yeah.
Well, I want to respect your time and thank you so much for this rich conversation. I know we could have kept it going until the wee hours. There's so much there. But thank you so much for being willing to share not only like your thoughts and your intellectual contributions, but yourselves and your spiritual selves that you brought with you tonight. So thank you so much to all of you. And thanks to those of you who joined us for this conversation. I hope this is just a beginning. We'll look forward to seeing you another time.